down to business.
When he drinks, he thinks.
That's the nectar of the gods, baby.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the #1 liquid-fueled, liquid-lubricated show on the interwebs. This is the Whiskey Musings broadcast, and I am your U.S. citizenship leading host, Rick. That's right, tonight, U.S. citizenship. You know, we've heard a lot of talk about having, voting rights for citizens and voting rights here and there, and talk of illegals voting, and New York City doing their illegal, making it so that all sorts of immigrants and non-U.S. citizens voting. In fact, I did an episode on this, episode 78. This is kind of a follow-on to that episode from the standpoint of understanding what a citizen, what constitutes a citizen. And I use the term constitute specifically because I'm taking a look tonight at the Constitution. You know, the Constitution, I think, is one of the greatest documents that has ever been created on this earth. It is our founding document, and I have to admit it was put together by some what would otherwise be not necessarily brilliant men, but together as a collective, they came up with the most brilliant form of government that this earth has ever seen at all. Right here in America. And we are 100% privileged to be able to be born here in the U.S., to be considered United States citizens. But being born here isn't exactly the only thing that can happen. As we all know, you can be a naturalized citizen. You can come here and get your citizenship through taking a citizenship test. And we're going to be taking a look at all of this and how it relates in history in comparison to today, right here tonight. But first, I have to thank all of you, my subscribers, my fellow and faithful followers, Catriots, all of you people who listen to the Catriot broadcast who have subscribed, all of you people who did know nothing about Catriots and have subscribed. This show is because of you, my subscribers, my watchers, my listeners on the audio portion of the program, all of you. This show would not exist without your coming and taking a small bit of your time out of your week to spend it with me and listen to what I have to say and what information I have to pass along to you. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart. But hey, if this is your first time here and you like what you see, do me a favor, subscribe. Now, fittingly for tonight, my we'll call it my sponsorship, I guess, even though they aren't officially a sponsor. They are an affiliate. I am an affiliate of theirs. Correct. The correct term. And you know what? I just realized, give me a second, because I didn't pull up the script. Hold on for just a second while I get this up. And because this is here, so just give me just a moment. Oh my goodness. This is so bad. I can't even believe I did this. But anyway, all right. So here we go. The Institute on the Constitution, ironically, because we are talking about the Constitution tonight, I recommend that you go to the Institute on the Constitution and get some of their learning materials. The Institute on the Constitution was established in 2004 as a 501c3 nonprofit corporation with one mission: to restore the constitutional republic through grassroots education. All courses and materials are developed using primary source documents and taught from the American view of law and government, as defined in the Declaration of Independence in the following 3 key points. 1, there is a God. 2, our rights come from him. And 3, the purpose of civil government is to secure and protect our God-given rights. The IOTC offers the opportunity to educate yourself on our most precious founding document, the Constitution, of the United States. They also provide tools to educate your community and get involved with local government. Start by taking their free U.S. Constitution course and go from there. Use my affiliate link, theamericanview.com/# Whiskey Musings to sign up. And while you're there, take a moment to look through their other course material and information. My affiliate link, once again, is theamericanview.com / ##, whatever you want to call it, Whiskey Musings, all lowercase, all one word, to get great content, to learn about our historical founding and support the show in the process. That's theamericanview.com / Whiskey Musings. Go check them out today. All right. Thank you. It always does that. Thank you, Institute on the Constitution, for allowing me to be an affiliate. Now, so, you know, in episode 78, I brought up the idea of non-citizen voting. And there's a lot of people that are out there that are talking about non-citizens. I mean, the state of California has discussed allowing non-citizens to vote in their state elections for, you know, the last several election cycles. And New York City just passed a law that brings non-citizens the opportunity to vote in city elections. By the way, that is going to court. The Republican Party has, the Republican Party of New York has filed a lawsuit against that because of kind of what we're going to be talking about tonight. Now, hang on. One thing that a lot of people don't understand is that the term citizen has been used in a lot of formats, a lot of legal documentation, the Constitution itself. But there really wasn't a like full-on definition within the Constitution until the 14th Amendment became ratified in 1866. Now, it's kind of interesting how that all works out, and I've got a ton of information on that. But as always, we have to honor this day in American history. That's right. On this day in American history, we go into our American Patriots Almanac, and we read from today's date. Today's date is January 22nd, and we are talking about Abigail Adams. My dearest friend, wrote Abigail Adams on January 22nd, 1797. We have had this day something very like a snowstorm. It has banked some, though very not... No, excuse me. Let me try that again. Oh my gosh, the alcohol's already gotten to me. It has banked some, though not very deep. So ran one of the hundreds of letters she penned to her husband John during their 54-year marriage. When John began to aid the patriot cause, Abigail stood beside him, even though rebellion threatened his livelihood as a lawyer. When he was asked to serve in the Massachusetts Assembly, she made ready to share whatever dangers would come, though it meant the king might consider her family traitors. While John was in Philadelphia at meetings of the Continental Congress, Abigail stayed home in Quincy, Massachusetts, to run their farm. She tended the garden and orchards, looked after the livestock, sold milk and butter, and taught their children, one of them, John Quincy, a future president. When war came to Massachusetts, Abigail traded for food since American money was worthless. She took refugees into her house and calmed her children as gunfire sounded across the hills. While John worked in Congress, she wrote to him almost daily, encouraging him, keeping up his spirits, giving advice, and sending him war news from New England. Twice, Abigail saw John cross the sea to represent the new American government abroad. It meant years. Think about that. Years of being apart. When John grew so miserable he could not go on without her, she sailed to Europe to join him. When John became the second president, Abigail worked by his side, giving her counsel, helping him with his papers and speeches, and entertaining dignitaries. She opened the brand new White House, which at the time was an unfinished mansion in a swamp. When we count this nation's blessings, it is good to remember that without women like Abigail Adams, there would never have been a United States. And that is today's, on this day in history, January 22nd. Okay. So let's talk about citizenship. All right. So, we toss around the idea of citizenship and what it means to be a U.S. citizen. We toss it about as though, it's something special and to be revered. And believe me, it is. To be a citizen of what is considered to be one of the greatest countries that has ever graced this planet, especially in the modern era, even though we've had our own problems throughout history, we've had all kinds of issues. But the key point of the Constitution and its founding had to be that we were going to create a not necessarily utopian position, but a very, very great country. As long as our principles and as long as our values stayed within those bedrock principles that we put together for our founding, this country will continue to be a great country and a beacon of freedom across the globe for all other worlds and countries to see. But the thing about it is, though, is we did have some dark times. We had some dark times in dealing with our new founding and in dealing with things like slavery. We did have slaves here. There is no denying that. No matter what anybody tells you, we had some dark times in our history. And it wasn't until the Civil War that we actually decided to abolish slavery. President Lincoln was the one that did it. And as a part of his presidency, during his time of presidency, the 14th Amendment was put forth. It was ratified in 1866. This is right after the Civil War had ended. And the controversy about it had to deal with the fact that previous to this, the idea of being a U.S. citizen was sort of a vague and nebulous type of idea. In fact, it wasn't until the 14th Amendment that anybody really got down and actually determined what qualifies someone to be a U.S. citizen. And even when they did, they kind of left some gaps because there was some obvious truths back then that they believed would carry forward. And it wasn't until we started to get things going within this country, and especially dealing with the newly freed slaves and how we were going to deal with adopting these new persons within this country, that we actually started to have conversations about what actually makes a U.S. citizen, what constitutes a U.S. citizen. Now, in the original Constitution, the only time that the word citizen actually shows up isn't until Article 3. And in particular, what Article 3 was covering was the courts. And the whole purpose of saying the word citizen was to define, in a legal sense, who the courts would be able to hear court cases by. And so up until that point, there really wasn't any kind of definition of citizenship. So when the Civil War came to a close and we freed all of the slaves through the Emancipation Proclamation, all of a sudden we had a bunch of new people who were existing on this continent and in this country who were now we now had to legally define them in some way, shape, or form. And one of the things that kicked off the whole Civil War was a decision done by the Supreme Court in Dred Scott versus the name escapes me, but they call it the Dred Scott court case. And basically, what happened there was that a slave owner took his slave, which at the time, wrongfully so, but at the time was property, And he took that slave into what was considered a free state, because back then you'll know that you'll remember that there were free states and there were slave states. Well, because this slave owner took his property, his slave, into a free state, that slave at the time then brought a court case and said, hey, I'm now a free person because I was brought into a slave state, or from a slave state into a free state. And what ended up happening is the Supreme Court actually ruled that no, that isn't the case. Now, if you recall and remember our American structure, the Supreme Court and the federal government, one of their purposes in being over the overarching law of the land was in order to help facilitate these arguments between the states and to help make it to make a common ground or a ruling or a sounding board, a mediator, whatever it is that you want to call this. And they made it so that the federal government was actually supposed to rule over the states. And that's where the Supreme Court comes in, is that the Supreme Court is supposed to hear cases, compare them to the Constitution of the United States, and try and figure out a way, if it's not defined in law, a way to give way to the citizens of both states and kind of mediate between them. Now, the 14th Amendment also does a couple of other things in terms of the citizenship clause. It also has the equal I'm blanking here, but the equal treatment across states and that kind of stuff. It adds a layer of definition for what was originally written in the Constitution. But what I really want to talk about tonight has to deal with the definition of a U.S. citizen, because if you remember in episode 78, that was one of my questions at the end of it, was that it really depends on what you constitute or what you believe to be what a U.S. citizen actually is, as to whether or not people coming into this country can actually vote in a part of our elections. Now, a lot of people, well, before I get into some of that, let's go ahead and take a look at the clause in particular in the 14th Amendment that I'm discussing and that I'm talking about here. So the 14th Amendment, this is section 1. As soon as I can pull it up here, we'll do that. All right. So this is section 1, and let me just read it to you. So section 1 says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. That's what I was looking for, was equal protection. So you'll sometimes hear the 14th Amendment being talked about as far as like the equal protection. So let's kind of break this down. So the first thing, obviously, is that they use the term all persons. And there's a reason why they chose that term. And I've looked through, I have links in the show notes to the full transcript of the debate about the 14th Amendment. And one of the things that was talked about within that was how to classify all of these newly freed slaves. And so one of the things that they did was rather than say things like all men or all free men, or any of those other phrases that they had been using consistently up until this point to try and discuss and talk about these newly freed slaves in conjunction with the rest of the aforementioned citizens of the United States, they decided on the term all persons. So pretty much what they're basically saying is anyone, for the most part, who is born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Because another thing that happened a lot in the early formation of our founding had to deal with, well, what constitutes a citizen of a state? Like, how do you define when you are a citizen of the state, and whose laws that state in terms of the state laws whose laws are they supposed to follow? So for an example, if somebody comes from one state and is traveling in another state, you would automatically think, okay, well, that person getting arrested for something that was happening within the state that they traveled to, are they considered a citizen of that state? And so up until the point that the 14th Amendment came around, there wasn't any real classification as to what happened there. Now, keep in mind, all of this has to revolve around the idea of legalese and legal definitions, and making sure that someone who is accused of a crime in one state that isn't a crime in another, where did the legal jurisdictions and boundaries actually fall? So up until the 14th Amendment, there was a lot of controversy and debate and, any kind of other adjectives that you can use there in terms of people who were traveling across states or whatever, whether or not they could be, subject to the laws of those states. And so this is where the whole idea of, hey, a person who is a member of that state or a citizen of that state has to reside within that state in order to be considered a citizen of that state. And to carry that further, because they are a citizen of that state, they are also a citizen of the United States at the same time. Now, again, keep in mind, this is all right at the end of the Civil War, and how are they going to deal with all of these newly freed slaves? Now, there's one piece out of this section that I want you to pay special attention to, and I'm going to bring this up a little bit later as well. But the special attention is the comma and the additional clause here. So let's read this again, this first statement. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Now, why would they put that in there? What would be the purpose of that? Well, the reason being is, if you recall, this country was not from sea to shining sea, a full set of states. There were territories, there were areas of wildness, there were, they hadn't been considered states yet. So legally, there are also people who were here before us. For example, the Native Americans and many of the tribes, the Native American tribes that were out there, they actually were not considered citizens of the United States because they weren't subject to the jurisdiction, meaning they weren't necessarily subject to our laws. Now, this is a key point because this got thrown in and placed in there in terms of being able to deal with the additional people nowadays when we're talking about, for an example, a foreign ambassador. So a foreign ambassador comes over here, spends several years as the ambassador to the United States from, let's just say Uzbekistan or something like that, and they have a child. Well, technically, according to the first line, all persons born in the United States are citizens of the United States. So without this clause talking about being subject to the jurisdiction thereof, they would, if they were just simply born here, even though they were from a foreign country, that could catch up to them and that could make it to where they are a citizen of the United States. So that's where this phrase got thrown in there. They wanted to make sure that somebody who was born here and subject to our laws, meaning that they have to be a part of a group that is subject to our legal system, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, and they become citizens of the United States. Now, you also notice the term naturalized. So naturalization obviously has to deal with somebody coming from another country, emigrating here, and wanting to become a citizen of the United States. So essentially, anyone who is born here or naturalized here is a citizen of the United States. And with that citizenship comes a bunch of very special rights. Number one, meaning that the U.S. Constitution and all of its laws that we've created for this government are applied to them. This is part of the reason why foreign nationals have what's called diplomatic immunity, because they are not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. They're subject to the jurisdiction of their home country. And this is part of the reason why we have this phrasing and some of the things that we do in terms of our legal system and how it works. Now, let me go back here. All right. So if somebody is born here, okay, and they become or they are here naturalized, how do we know that they are part of our country? How do we understand that? So there's a documentation. We were talking about the interpretation of the citizenship clause. I've got it in the show notes. And let's just take a second. I'm trying to figure out where I need to be because I got lost in my place. Okay. So again, keep in mind, remember when we were talking about before they adopted the 14th Amendment to the United States, they were talking about, the Dred Scott versus Sanford case. That was in 1857. And he was held as a slave. Like I said, he sued the executor of his former master's estate. So I'm sorry, the former master died, okay, and he sued the executor, basically claiming that because he had become free because his master had voluntarily taken him into what was considered free territory. Now, the Republican Party strongly opposed Dred Scott, strongly opposed the Dred Scott. And the reason being is because of the fact that they obviously wanted to get rid of slavery. I mean, excluding slavery from the territories was Republicans' principal goal at the time, even though we had just come down and again, we'd fought the Civil War and so on and so forth. And Abraham Lincoln won control of the White House in 1860 in regards to that. And they took the legal position saying that free blacks were indeed American citizens. Okay. So now, the Congress passed the Civil Rights Act in 1866, which declared that all persons born or naturalized in the United States were citizens in the state of which they live, thereby affirming the rule of citizenship by birth that did not depend on race. And that's the key, that you are a citizen if you are born here. Okay, so we probably have that. We pretty much have that. Now, you also have to remember that in the Civil Rights Act, originally they took out Indians, meaning Native Americans, that are not taxed. And I've already kind of talked about that. And the reason being is because, again, they felt that even though the Native Americans were here, they were still subject to the tribes. They weren't subject to U.S. laws. Okay. So that being said, they excluded them. Now, it wasn't until 1927, I believe, 1924 was when the legal definition was amended, and the Native Americans in their tribes, they were actually granted tribal membership, I guess is the best way to put it, and citizenship in the U.S. They actually didn't start recognizing that until 1924. Okay. So now you'll also remember that as far as citizenship is concerned, we also have things like, in order to be a senator or a president, or, the president of the United States definitely has to be a U.S. citizen. In order to run for office, there's specific rules in order to run for office. And one of them has to deal with citizenship. You also have things like voting, where, you can't vote unless you're a citizen. And even though the U.S. Constitution, kind of specifies that citizens are allowed to vote, the term citizen, you also have almost all of the state constitutions are written in such a way where they say that in order to vote, you need to be a citizen. Now, again, keep in mind, you have to be a citizen, meaning that you have to reside within that state based off of the 14th Amendment and the way that they've defined that. Okay. Now, so there's still a little bit of gaps in that in terms of the definitions. Now, because the Constitution and the 14th Amendment only really have that first clause, there has to be a little bit more narrowing of the definition of what a citizen actually is. And so, looking at, oh boy, I just noticed one of my screenshots covers up a little bit of stuff. So hold on just a second. Let me, give me just a second here. Let me go back. Whoops. Look at that. Let me go back to my material here. Oh. Okay, where is it? Here we go. Is this it? No. That's not it. That's not what I want. I want the original. I guess this is the original. Okay. Well, we'll just go with this. Okay, so in as far as like defining what a citizen is, and I apologize for that, but as defining what a citizen is, we had to codify it a little bit more. And so number 8, U.S. Code 1401 defines it a little further. And basically, they kind of take a little bit from the 14th Amendment. So the first bullet point is that a person born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. That is a really key point, okay? A person born in the United States who is a member of, a bunch of like the Indian, Eskimo, Aleutian, or other Aboriginal tribe, provided that granting citizenship, under these laws, and there's some legalese, that's where it kind of falls out. But give me just a second here. Let me get this up. So this is what the U.S. immigration calls a U.S. citizen. Okay. So citizenship in the United States is a status that entails specific rights, duties, and benefits. So U.S. citizenship is usually acquired by birth when a child is born in the territory of the United States. So in addition, so this isn't, now keep in mind, it isn't just being born within the 50 states. You can also be a U.S. citizen by being born in the District of Columbia, which again is not a state. Guam, Puerto Rico, the Northern Mariana Islands, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And there's a couple places that if you're born, you're actually not considered a U.S. citizen. And I'll get to that in just a minute. But a U.S. citizen has the right to live and work in the United States and to receive federal assistance. Now, there's two ways to become a U.S. citizen, generally. One is by birth. Now, in which a person is presumed to be a citizen, provided that they are born within the territorial limits of the United States. Now, here's a key point. Or through citizenship of a parent. It's this clause, because, my wife and I were talking about this show, and she asked me, she's like, well, wait a minute, what happens if you're born on like a U.S. Military installation, say over in South Korea or in Germany in particular? Well, this particular clause is through the citizenship of a parent, meaning that if your parents are already American citizens and you are born to that parent, in specific, it's actually the mother. If you're born through that parent and that person, that individual had a residence within the United States within the last calendar year, and you're born abroad, then yes, you are considered a citizen of the United States. And this is how military people and people serving abroad, like ambassadors and things like that, can still remain citizens, U.S. citizens, even though they weren't technically born on foreign soil. Now, if they're born on outside of like a military installation, so let's say they go on some trip and we don't have any what would be considered U.S. soil places in that particular country, well, then they would be considered a foreign-born U.S. citizen because, again, they're getting it through the parents, even though they may have been foreign-born. Now, what's odd here is that the United States actually does not recognize, at least to the point of my knowledge at the point of this show, they do not recognize what's considered dual citizenship. Some countries do. For an example, I have a relative that was actually born on a military installation in Germany many, many years ago. And at the time, that individual was able to be a dual citizen between Germany and the United States. Now, the United States would only recognize the United States side, obviously being a U.S. citizen. They wouldn't actually recognize the fact that they were a German citizen. But the German citizen on the Germany side, Germany would actually accept them as a citizen as well as a U.S. citizen because Germany at the time, unless something has changed, they recognize dual citizenship. And there are some places throughout the globe today that have dual citizenship like that. But America doesn't. And one of the reasons is because of the fact that when you become naturalized, we don't recognize dual citizenship because we assume that in order to be a citizen, you must have what's considered allegiance to the United States only, that you don't have any other allegiances elsewhere. And that's where that clause in the 14th Amendment about subject to the jurisdiction thereof, that's also interpreted in that fashion, meaning that a U.S. citizen has to not have any foreign allegiances, any possibility of foreign allegiances. Now, there are some arguments that have been made about people who have come to this country through immigration, we'll call it less than legal immigration, and have crossed into the country and then had a child born here. Now, the definition that's been tossed around is known as anchor babies. Basically what it is that you have a foreign citizen who's come across entered into this country and has had a child here. Now, based on the definition of U.S. citizenship, once you are born here on the U.S., you are a U.S. citizen. But the problem here, and this is where some of the controversy is coming into play, especially in dealing with illegal immigrants who have come here and have had children, are those children actually U.S. citizens and or are they able to, by their very nature of being born here, are they able to, number one, stay here? And then secondly, is it conferred backwards up to the parents? Because if you remember, it's usually going from the parents downward is the typical way of thinking about things. So the question has to be in play is, okay, what happens in those cases where if you're coming over here, because again, keep in mind being subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Now, as a child, as a person who is under the age of 21 or 18, recognized as an adult here in the U.S., a child who is subject to another or has allegiances to another foreign country, do they and are they allowed to be U.S. citizens? And so this is where citizenship for those types of people in those situations is hotly contested. Okay. Now, based on today's laws and the way that the court system so far has kind of interpreted it and the way lawyers are interpreting it is that, look, if you're born here in the U.S., you're automatically a U.S. citizen. Doesn't matter. Just you're born here, you're a U.S. citizen. You're not part of like a foreign dignitary or anything like that. You're a U.S. citizen. And so far that hasn't been challenged. In fact, to the best of my knowledge, there hasn't actually been any court cases that have challenged anything about the 14th Amendment in terms of the citizenship part of it since its inception. In fact, there's even some question by some people because of the method and way that the 14th Amendment was ratified, meaning that there was a segment of the Congress that was actually arrested and removed from the Congress at the time, even though they were duly elected representatives, there is some suggestion that the 14th Amendment may actually not have been legal. And the reason being is because of the fact that they didn't have the required number of people to be able to ratify the 14th Amendment according to Congress's rules at the time, which was 3/4 of a Congress. They didn't have enough. And so because of that, they were like, oh boy, there's some people, some constitutional people who are arguing or have argued that the 14th Amendment actually isn't a true amendment because it was ratified in an unconstitutional manner. Now that for absolute certain has never come up in front of the court. That has never come up in front of the court. So there might be some question there. I mean, you might be able to make an argument. However, I believe that in terms of the fact that it's been since, 1866, it's never been argued. So chances are, pretty much everybody kind of follows along with the idea that if you're born here, you are an American citizen. Okay. Now moving on here again, this is the U.S. immigration. There's two ways to become a U.S. citizen: by birth, in which a person is presumed to be a citizen, provided that they are born within the territorial limits of the United States, or through citizenship of a parent; and naturalization, which is a process by which an immigrant applies for citizenship and is accepted. Both pathways for citizenship are specified in the Citizenship Clause of the Constitution's 1868 14th Amendment. Now, naturalization. I can tell you that as far as the naturalization oath is concerned, that oath does specify that you must, as a naturalized citizen, you must renounce your citizenship to any other country. You must renounce any protections, any allegiances, any of that stuff. You, as a part of the oath, when you take the oath to become a U.S. citizen, you must renounce all of that. And that's the purpose and the reason why I'm saying that we don't recognize dual citizenship. Okay. Now, the first concept of citizenship began in colonial times as an operative relation between people working cooperatively to solve local problems and participating actively in democratic decision-making. People met regularly to discuss local affairs and make decisions. Citizenship became less defined by participation in politics and more defined as a legal relation with accompanying rights and privileges. And that's what I'm saying again. The original Constitution didn't actually use the term citizen until Article 3 in order to understand legal jurisdictional purposes. So, all right. So we've got a kind of an idea of what a citizen actually is and how you become a citizen. But did you realize that there's actually a couple of other categories of people in this country that are not U.S. citizens? And one of them has to deal with pretty much anybody, anybody has heard about this, I'm sure, is a permanent resident. Now, a permanent resident is a green card holder. They are somebody who has come here, has lived here for quite some time, and essentially, decides that they're going to live here. They are allowed to live here as long as they want. And this is where they get the green card. So they are a permanent resident of the United States, meaning that they can live here. But the thing about it is that if they are a permanent resident, they actually are not afforded all of the rights that a U.S. citizen would be. So they can't, technically, they are not supposed to vote in our elections. They can be taxed, though. So because they can be taxed, they're considered, based off of the IRS, they're considered to be a resident here, and they are subject to our laws because they can get arrested and everything else under the U.S. Constitution. But they're not a U.S. citizen, so they are not afforded all of the rights of citizenship. There is one other legal definition for or under the U.S. Laws, let's say, not necessarily under the Constitution, but U.S. laws. and that is the term of a U.S. national. Now, assumably, and this is what everybody assumes, is that you're a U.S. citizen, but you're also a U.S. national. So you're actually both when you're a U.S. citizen. But you can be a U.S. national without being a U.S. citizen. And this is what I was talking about in terms of the idea of citizenship being born within a territorial space of the United States, but yet not being a U.S. citizen. Now, we already mentioned Guam. We already mentioned Puerto Rico. We mentioned a couple other places that are territories of the United States. But there's a couple places in particular that you can't, if you are born there, you are actually not a U.S. citizen. You are a U.S. national, but you are not a U.S. citizen. And those two places in particular are Wake Island and, oh boy, what was the other one? Hang on just a second. Let me get that up. I'm just failing here. Wake Island and Midway Island. So persons born in those outlying possessions, American Samoa, I believe, is another one. Americans or persons born in those outlying possessions of the United States and their children are only U.S. nationals. They are not considered U.S. citizens. They owe allegiance to the United States and enjoy some of the rights, but they are not given all of the rights of a U.S. citizen. So this is kind of interesting, but not every national possesses the same rights. That's what I'm saying. So now, if a person is born, like I was saying, if a person is born outside of the United States and has, again, people, especially military children, ambassadors in other countries, things like that, as long as the parents have been citizens and have lived inside the United States, at least within the past year or whatever, they are considered a U.S. citizen. Now, what's kind of interesting, though, is if you were to leave the U.S., okay, so let's say you take off and you go around the world. Realistically, it doesn't, and you were a U.S. citizen before you left. You could take off and go around the world and do all these different things and travel throughout the world, never having stepped foot back in America again for what conceivably is an indefinite period of time. The minute that you come back, though, you are still a U.S. citizen unless you renounce your citizenship. And that is allowed. You can actually renounce your citizenship here in the U.S. Granted, it's not done very often, but it is possible. It is possible to do. And essentially, the whole idea of that, honestly, I have no idea why anybody would do it. But somebody might want to renounce their citizenship here. And once it's renounced, then you're no longer a U.S. citizen. Even though you were born here, you're no longer a U.S. citizen. You're no longer allowed to vote. You're no longer allowed to do, be granted the rights that we here in America take as a part of our heritage and our freedoms here in the U.S. So, again, kind of thinking about this in terms of people who are voting, like I was saying in episode 78, having a non-citizen vote, being a U.S. citizen gives you that opportunity to be able to vote, to be able to take part in our election process, our constitutional republic electoral process. It's not a democracy. We are a constitutional republic. But again, kind of keep in mind that there are certain ways that you have to become a U.S. citizen. And most of the states do talk about voting as per citizenship. The Constitution also calls out citizens have the right to vote. But it depends on that definition of citizenship as to how we're going to get to the point of dealing with voting. And this is part of the reason why the whole Freedom to Vote Act and I can't even think of the guy's name, but the John something act that got defeated here recently because the Senate couldn't get past the filibuster. We as Americans, we take our right to vote very, very seriously. And so keeping in mind that you should be a citizen in order to vote. Now, there's some arguments that could be made by somebody who lives here and pays taxes here, like a permanent resident, as to whether or not they should be given the right to vote essentially locally. There could be some arguments made there. And, I'd be willing to listen to that. But as far as voting rights are concerned across the board, citizenship, being subject to the jurisdiction thereof, here, being born here, being naturalized here, these are the key points of the Constitution and U.S. citizenship. And that's my final Whiskey Musings thought for the evening. I apologize for the somewhat, little bit late start. But that being said, I appreciate all of you from coming out. And do me a favor, if you like the content that I'm providing for you and you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe on Rumble in particular, because I prefer there. Or if you like YouTube, go ahead and subscribe on YouTube. Just understand that there may be some topics that might get me kicked off of YouTube, because all of that stuff is occurring. In today's day and age, we have several conservative people that have been kicked off of YouTube for whatever reason. But if you appreciate what I'm saying, do me a favor, click subscribe, and hey, we'll see you next time on the Whiskey Musings broadcast. Good night, everybody. Ooh, as soon as I can find, there it is.